The flight attendant's voice was sharp as she looked down at the woman seated in first class. "You don't belong here," she snapped, her blue uniform crisp as she folded her arms. Passengers turned their heads, sensing tension in the air. The woman in the plush leather seat, a striking figure with smooth confidence, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She was dressed simply, yet with an elegance that hinted at something more. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move," the flight attendant insisted, her frustration growing. "First class is reserved for VIPs. The woman's calm demeanor only seemed to agitate her more. "I am exactly where I need to be," she replied, her voice steady. The flight attendant scoffed. "I don't have time for this." And before anyone could react, she did the unthinkable. A sharp slap echoed through the cabin. Gasps filled the air. A man in a sleek suit, who had been quietly observing from a few rows back, finally stood up. "That's enough," he said firmly. The flight attendant turned to protest, but the words caught in her throat as she realized who the man was, and more importantly, who the woman she had just struck really was. The cabin fell into stunned silence. The flight attendant's hand trembled slightly as she realized what she had just done. The man in the suit took a step forward, his expression unreadable. He was clearly someone important, but her focus was still on the woman she had just struck. The woman slowly turned her head back, her eyes locked onto the flight attendant's. There was no anger, no immediate reaction, just an unsettling calm. "Do you know who I am?" she finally asked, her voice smooth and controlled. The flight attendant hesitated. She had assumed this woman was just another passenger who had somehow ended up in first class without the right ticket. But now doubt crept in. The way she carried herself, the way the man in the suit had reacted, it didn't add up. Passengers whispered among themselves, unsure of what was happening. The flight attendant's confidence wavered as she looked at the man, hoping for support. Instead, he sighed, shaking his head. "I was going to let you figure it out on your own," he said, his tone disappointed. "But you just made the biggest mistake of your career." The flight attendant swallowed hard. What had she done? The flight attendant's heart pounded as she took a shaky step back. Passengers were still whispering, eyes darting between her and the woman she had just confronted. She felt the weight of their stares, the growing tension in the air pressing down on her. But she couldn't understand. Who was this woman? And why did it feel like she had just made an irreversible mistake? The man in the suit ran a hand through his neatly styled hair and glanced at the woman still seated. "Do you want to handle this, or should I?" he asked, his voice low. The woman sighed, adjusting the sleeve of her designer blouse. "I want to see where this goes," she said, her tone almost amused. But there was something behind her words, a quiet authority that sent a chill down the flight attendant's spine. Trying to regain control, the flight attendant straightened her posture. "Look, I don't know what's going on here, but if you don't have a valid ticket..." The woman let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "A valid ticket," she repeated, as if the words themselves were ridiculous. She reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek black card, handing it to the man beside her. He turned it over in his hands, then looked up at the flight attendant. "This isn't a ticket," he said. "It's proof that she owns the plane." The color drained from the flight attendant's face. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Suddenly, the situation had shifted, and she was no longer in control. The flight attendant felt a cold wave of panic rush through her. Her mind raced as she replayed everything, the harsh words, the dismissive attitude, the slap. She had treated this woman like an unwelcome passenger, never once imagining she was the owner of the very plane she was working on. The weight of her mistake settled deep in her chest, making it hard to breathe. The woman sat back in her seat, watching the flight attendant with an unreadable expression. The man beside her remained quiet, waiting for her to speak first. Every second of silence stretched painfully long, thick with tension. The other passengers, once merely observers, were now captivated, their eyes flicking between them, waiting for the inevitable fallout. "I assume you have something to say," the woman finally said, her voice calm but firm. The flight attendant's lips parted, but no words came out. Apologizing didn't seem enough, not after what she had done. But before she could gather her thoughts, the cabin door suddenly swung open. The pilot stepped in, his face tense as he took in the scene. "Is there a problem here?" The man in the suit exhaled. "Oh, there's a problem," he muttered. The flight attendant's stomach dropped. She wasn't sure what was worse, the woman's unreadable expression, or the fact that everyone else in the cabin now knew exactly what she had done. The pilot's eyes moved between the flight attendant and the woman still seated in first class. He could sense the tension in the air, the way every passenger was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "Can someone explain what's going on?" he asked, his voice measured but firm. The flight attendant opened her mouth to speak, desperate to take control of the situation, but the man in the suit stepped forward first. "Before we get into that," he said, pulling out his phone, "you should know that the entire incident was recorded by multiple passengers." He gestured subtly toward a few people holding their phones at their sides, screens still glowing. The flight attendant's face turned pale. She hadn't even noticed the cameras. She had been so focused on proving her authority that she hadn't considered the consequences. Her hands clenched at her sides. "This is a misunderstanding," she said quickly, her voice unsteady. The woman, still calm, finally stood up. "No," she said, locking eyes with her. "This is exactly what it looks like." But before she could say anything more, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just received a priority communication. We may be making an emergency landing." The announcement sent a ripple of confusion through the cabin. The pilot's face stiffened. "That wasn't from my crew," he said, his voice sharp. The woman exchanged a look with the man beside her. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than just this confrontation. And now, no one on this plane was in control of what came next. The cabin filled with nervous murmurs as passengers glanced around, trying to make sense of the sudden announcement. The pilot grabbed his radio, his face tense. "Control, this is Flight 247. We didn't authorize an emergency landing. What's going on?" Static crackled through the speaker before a distorted voice finally responded. "Stand by for instructions." The woman who owned the plane exchanged a look with the man beside her. "This isn't normal," she muttered under her breath. Then, turning to the flight attendant, she asked, "Are you sure you want this to be your last mistake today?" The flight attendant swallowed hard, realizing that whatever was happening was far beyond her. The tension she had created now seemed insignificant compared to the unknown threat they were facing. She gave a small, desperate shake of her head. The pilot motioned for silence as he listened to another incoming transmission. Then his expression darkened. "They're ordering us to land at a private airstrip." No explanation. The woman exhaled slowly, then pulled out her phone and dialed a number. "It's me," she said as soon as the call connected. "Someone's trying to interfere with my plane. Find out who." The flight attendant's breath hitched. This wasn't just any billionaire. This woman had real power. And now the real question wasn't whether the flight attendant would lose her job. It was what they had just flown into. The tension in the cabin was unbearable as the plane began its descent. The pilot, gripping the controls tightly, exchanged glances with the crew, ready for anything. The billionaire remained calm, her phone pressed to her ear as she listened. Then after a long pause, she finally spoke. Understood. She ended the call and looked at the man beside her. It's been handled. The flight attendant, still shaken, couldn't help but whisper, What do you mean? Handled. The woman turned to her, her gaze unreadable. Let's just say someone made a very poor decision trying to interfere with this flight. She glanced at the pilot. Proceed with the landing. But you'll find that the emergency has suddenly been resolved. True to her words, another transmission came through. Flight 247, you are clear to continue to your original destination. The priority landing has been canceled. The pilot let out a breath of relief and adjusted the controls. As the tension eased, the flight attendant lowered her gaze, realizing she had been so focused on power that she had completely misjudged the true authority on board. The billionaire gave her one last look. Lesson learned, she asked softly. The flight attendant nodded, barely able to speak. The woman smiled slightly and turned back to her seat, leaving the flight attendant with the weight of her own choices. The plane soared forward, but for some, this flight had changed everything.